Hello hockey fans, Oddman Rush here and welcome back to another video. When a hockey player does something that they're not supposed to, they're typically given some kind of punishment for their actions, such as a brief trip to the penalty box, an ejection from the game, or even a suspension from the league itself. Though most players commit several penalties every season, they are typically minor in nature and they rarely require any form of intervention from some kind of higher legal power. That said, there have been a surprising number of players who have been detained by the police due to their actions away from the rink, many of whom are still active in the league during the recent 22-23 season. So in today's video, join me as we explore 10 NHL players who were arrested by police. Kicking things off at number 10, we have Sebastian Aho. Not to be confused with that superstar in Carolina, the other Sebastian Aho has spent parts of 4 seasons with the New York Islanders and has begun to find his footing in the league, as he has scored 9 goals and 41 points in 132 NHL games. Though he produced a career year during the recent 22-23 season, the Swedish defenseman would have a run-in with the law this past summer, as on August 13th, 2022, Aho was arrested for drunk driving in his native Sweden. According to reports at the time, Aho had visited friends the night before and had had a few drinks while on vacation before getting into his car and driving off the following morning. Unfortunately for Aho though, the defenseman was stopped at a checkpoint at 10:30 AM and was found to still be over Sweden's legal alcohol limit by just 0.1%. Ooh, so close yet so far. As a result, Aho was fined 40,000 Swedish krona, approximately $3,700 and his driver's license was suspended too. Which certainly isn't the worst punishment we'll see in this video, but it's a pretty unfortunate end to what seemed like a rather fun night. Talk about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Next up at number 9 we have Jarrett Stoll. A 13-year veteran of the league, Jarrett Stoll played for 4 different teams during his lengthy NHL career. He scored 388 points in 872 games, and he won a pair of Stanley Cup championships with the Los Angeles Kings too. Sounds like a pretty successful career to me, folks. Shortly after his penultimate year in the show, Stoll would be caught red-handed by the police, as in April of 2015, Stoll was arrested for possession of cocaine and ecstasy while at a pool party at the MGM Grand Hotel in Las Vegas. Though he was initially charged with felony drug possession and could have served up to 4 years in prison, Stoll would eventually plead guilty to misdemeanor charges of trespass and breach of peace, and he would be required to perform 32 hours of community service as a result. Given the problems that they caused him and the punishment he received, I doubt that the high was worth the trouble in the long run. At least he was the only NHL player to have issues with drug possession, right? Moving on to number 8, we have Mike Richards. A 2008 NHL All-Star and a 2-time Cup champ with LA, Mike Richards would play 749 NHL games over parts of 11 seasons split between 3 different teams, scoring 181 goals and 487 points for his efforts. Towards the tail end of his NHL career though, Richards would find himself in a similar situation to Jarrett Stoll, as on June 17, 2015, the 30-year-old was arrested for unlawful possession of a controlled substance. According to reports at the time, Richards had attempted to cross the US-Canadian border while in possession of oxycodone, a highly addictive and commonly abused opioid without a valid subscription on him. After being detained by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and after a 2-month investigation into the incident, Richards was charged with possession of a controlled substance, a charge that carries a maximum sentence of up to 5 years in prison. Luckily for Richards though, no jail time would be required, as a Canadian judge stayed the proceedings and determined that prosecution was no longer warranted for this particular case, though it could be reopened within the following year should it be required. While the case was never reopened and Richards would avoid any kind of legal punishment, this ordeal would cost him his contract with the Kings, as LA announced that they had terminated Richards' deal shortly after the incident took place. Now Richards would reach a settlement with the Kings shortly after, and he would spend another year in the NHL with the Washington Capitals, but given that he still had 5 years and over $22 million left on his contract with LA, if you can't do the time, you really shouldn't do the crime, no matter how silly it might seem on the surface. At number 7, we have Dustin Byfuglien. The recent subject of a Whatever Happened To video, Big Buff spent parts of 15 seasons in the NHL, scored 525 points in 869 regular season games, and he won the 2010 Stanley Cup with the Chicago Blackhawks too. Add to that his insanely strong physical play, and they really don't make them like Byfuglien anymore, do they? Midway through his lengthy pro career, Byfuglien would find himself in police custody, as the American defenseman was arrested by law enforcement on August 31st, 2011 for suspicion of driving a boat while intoxicated. According to the reports, the 26-year-old was detained on Lake Minnetonka at 8:15 p.m. and refused to submit to a blood or urine test for alcohol consumption, prompting the police to take Byfuglien to jail and release him 3 hours later once formal charges were arranged. From there, Byfuglien would attend a court hearing on July 23, 2012. He would plead guilty to his charges, and he was sentenced to 2 days of community service as a result. Say what you want about his decision that day, but I'm just impressed that the police managed to detain Byfuglien. I mean, the guy is built like a freight train and knows how to hit like one too. They're lucky they managed to get him into the jail without anyone suffering any kind of consequences, right? On to number 6, we have Bobby Ryan. A productive scorer throughout his career, Bobby Ryan would register 569 points in 866 NHL games, play parts of 14 seasons in the league after spending the final year of his career with the Detroit Red Wings, and after leaving the league behind following the 2021 season, the American forward would be detained by law enforcement less than a year ago, as on July 27, 2022, Ryan was arrested for public intoxication while at an airport in Nashville. According to reports at the time, Ryan took several items from an airport store without paying for them and then left them on a nearby counter before walking away from the scene entirely. Once airport security caught up to Ryan at an airport bar, the former forward was said to have slurred speech, was completely unaware of who or where he was, and he posed a danger both to himself and others around him. After officers approached Ryan and the forward refused to comply with their demands, the 35-year-old was arrested shortly after. Despite being taken into custody and spending the next 8 hours in an intoxication hold, neither the airport nor the store itself chose to escalate the situation any further, so Ryan was released from custody the following morning without any charges against him. Since Ryan has been so vocal about his struggles with alcohol addiction, and given that he showed immediate remorse for his behaviour that day, here's hoping that he has gotten the help that he's needed and he's back on the road to recovery once again. He's certainly earned it given everything he's been through, especially early on in his life, you know. Halfway through this list now at number 5, we have Sonny Milano and AJ Greer. Two guys that took a while to make it to the show, Milano and Greer have finally found their respective places in the league, as they both spent the entire 22-23 season exclusively in the NHL, and they each produced some of, if not the best numbers of their careers while they were at it too. Before their eventual arrivals though, Milano and Greer would find themselves in trouble with the law, as on July 7th, 2019, the pair were arrested for third-degree assault. According to the reports, an individual had promised Milano and Greer that he could get them table service at a New York nightclub for $600 each, but after they returned to Milano's apartment at the end of the evening, the victim demanded more money from them, which prompted the players to allegedly strike the individual in the face and the body. Though a court date was set for later that year, the charges were eventually dropped in January of 2020 after Greer and Milano both paid an undisclosed amount for the victim's medical bills, and they each completed community service too. Now, while they were both punished for their actions and they suffered the consequences, the victim in this situation made out far better than he probably should have given the circumstances. I mean, he got $600 from each of these players, he had his medical bills taken care of, and he only suffered minor injuries too. That's a pretty sweet deal, given that he had tried to basically extort money from a pair of bottom 6 NHL players. Those guys know how to throw their punches, you know. Next, at number 4, we have Claude Giroux. The longest tenured captain in Philadelphia Flyers franchise history, Claude Giroux has spent the last 16 seasons in the show. He has scored 1,002 points in 1,100 regular season games, and he has made it to the NHL All-Star on 7 separate occasions too. Talk about an underrated career, right guys? Despite his lengthy stay in Philly, Giroux had a rather embarrassing incident midway through his tenure, as on July 2nd, 2014, the 26-year-old was arrested by police for inappropriately touching an officer of the law. According to reports at the time, the Canadian forward was intoxicated outside of a nightclub in his native Ottawa, where he began repeatedly grabbing the buttocks of a male police officer. Though it is said that Giroux only grabbed the officer's butt on 2 separate occasions, the 26-year-old was placed into a police cruiser and was taken into custody. Whilst Giroux would avoid any kind of criminal charges, the forward would be placed on an intoxication hold and he would spend the night in jail sobering up. Since he would be released the following morning, and since he would continue to captain the Flyers for another 8 seasons, I imagine that Giroux wanted to move past this incident as quickly as possible and forget it ever happened. Luckily for him though, the internet is forever, so we can remind ourselves of it whenever we want. And this is why you don't drink too much and start grabbing people's butts, kids. At number 3, we have Ryan O'Reilly. A Stanley Cup champion and a playoff MVP, Ryan O'Reilly has spent 14 seasons in the NHL, has potted 702 points in 991 games, and he lifted the 2019 championship as a member of the St. Louis Blues. Sounds like a pretty successful career, guys. Several years before his cup-winning heroics though, O'Reilly would experience quite the run-in with the law, as on July 13th, 2015, the 24-year-old was detained by Ontario police for driving while impaired and failing to remain at the scene of a crime. According to the reports, O'Reilly crashed his 1951 green Chevrolet into a Tim Hortons and then fled the area shortly after the collision. Have you heard of anything more Canadian than that? Having left the scene of the crime, the Canadian forward would abandon the vehicle at the side of the road and attempt to escape on foot, but once law enforcement caught up with him, they tested his alcohol level and found it to be 0.8% over the legal limit, meaning he had been intoxicated through the whole ordeal. Luckily for O'Reilly though, he would avoid any punishment for his actions, as he was acquitted of all charges on July 11th, 2016, after the courts determined that there was insufficient evidence to prove that O'Reilly had driven the vehicle that night. Talk about dodging a bullet! Since he avoided any sort of legal repercussions, and since he hasn't had any other issues in the many years since then, I imagine that O'Reilly learned some valuable lessons from his experiences that night. And given how his career has panned out since then, it's a great thing that he did. I mean, you don't win a Conn Smythe trophy if you're a bad hockey player now, do you? Penultimately, at number 2, we have Semyon Varlamov. A steady netminder throughout his career, Semyon Varlamov has played 583 NHL games over parts of 15 seasons, split between the Washington Capitals, the Colorado Avalanche and the New York Islanders, registering a 272, 220 and 64 record, a 2.65 career goals against average, and a .916 career save percentage during that span. During his sophomore year with the Avalanche though, on October 30th, 2013, Varlamov was arrested by Denver police on domestic violence charges against his girlfriend at the time, including second-degree kidnapping and third-degree assault. Though he would be charged with misdemeanor assault less than a month later on November 22nd, and could face up to 2 years in prison as a result, the charges were dropped by a Denver judge on December 20th. Interestingly, it was the prosecution who requested that the charges be dropped, since they were unable to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. Having been fully exonerated of his crimes, Varlamov subsequently filed a civil suit against his girlfriend for abuse of process, and was later awarded over $120,000 in damages in order to pay his legal fees. Since there were some pretty serious crimes involved here, and since all of the charges were eventually dropped, I'm glad that Varlamov was able to rise above this whole ordeal and continue his long and successful NHL career. After all, accusations like these can have a damning effect on a person, and they can stay with them for years after the fact. It would have been truly awful if Varlamov was forced to suffer the consequences of something that he likely didn't do. That sort of stuff can ruin someone's life, you know? And finally, at number 1, we have Patrick Kane. One of the greatest American-born players the league has ever seen, Patrick Kane has produced quite the legendary NHL career, as he has scored 451 goals and 1,237 points in just 1,180 games. He's lifted 3 Stanley Cups with the Chicago Blackhawks, and he has won a treasure trove of individual awards, including the Calder Trophy for Rookie of the Year, a Conn Smythe Trophy for Playoff MVP, and a trio of scoring awards during the 15-16 NHL season too. Sounds like a Hall of Famer to me, guys. Despite his long list of achievements though, Kane found himself in some pretty hot water early in his career, as the American forward was arrested by law enforcement on August 9th, 2009 for robbing and assaulting a taxi driver in Buffalo, New York. According to the reports at the time, Kane and his cousin James had taken a taxi during the early hours of the morning and had paid the driver $15 for a $13.80 fare. But after the driver told the pair that he was short the 20 cents, the two Kanes allegedly grabbed their $15 back, they punched the taxi driver, they grabbed his throat, and supposedly broke his glasses too. Though Kane was said to have fled the scene of the crime, the 20-year-old was soon apprehended by law enforcement and was charged with second-degree robbery, fourth-degree criminal mischief, and theft of services for his actions. However, after pleading not guilty in front of a grand jury and after being cleared of any felony charges, Kane would eventually plead guilty to non-criminal disorderly conduct charges, which avoided any notable penalty provided he stayed out of trouble for the following year and formally apologised to the taxi driver. Given that he has avoided any similar incidents since then, and given that he has produced a long and successful career over the last decade and a half, I think it's fair to say that Patrick Kane learned his lesson. I mean, the guy has earned over $115 million while playing in the NHL. A 20-cent coin is the least of his worries anymore. And on that note, I'm going to end today's video. That was a look at 10 NHL players who were arrested by police. What do you guys think about the skaters that were discussed, or the reasons for their arrests? Are you surprised to see some of the names that were mentioned here, or did you know about all of these different incidents already? Also, do you want me to look at some more players who were arrested in a part 2? Do let me know your thoughts in the comments below, I would love to hear what you guys think. But thank you very much for watching, guys, I do hope you have enjoyed. Please feel free to like, subscribe, share, or watch some of my other videos. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye. A big thank you to Bexy93, Burned Retinas, Drew Fawcett, Houston NG, Raquel and Worthless Pieces for helping support this video via Patreon. If you too want to help support the channel a little bit further and get a shout out at the end of every future video, make sure you head over to patreon.com/oddmanrush and become a patron today.